All right, any other questions or comments? Okay, we sort of rushed through last time at the very end Aristotle's discussion of the different forms of government, and it's wise for me. This is the Hobbes lecture now, but it's going to be useful for all of us to see how the stuff that Aristotle offered merges over into some of this Hobbesian material, because there's a lot of time that separates the two, but the history of political thought is continuous enough that Hobbes, in fact, was responding to some Aristotelian themes, some Platonic themes, as we'll see, even if he wasn't doing it explicitly. Even if he didn't think of himself as doing that, you'll see that that's one way of understanding his approach to politics. Also, as you'll see, Hobbes, to explain Hobbes and his political theory, it's really useful to understand a little bit about what was going on in England at the time that Hobbes wrote this stuff in the middle of the 17th century, that is, the middle of the 1600s. So let's go back. I have to write this again because I forgot the piece of paper I wrote it on last time, but let's go back and look at the several forms. Do it like that. I'll call them the degenerate forms because I like that word. All forms of government are degenerate. Anyway, that's just my bias. Royalty. This is the rule of one. Tyranny is the degenerate form of royalty. The rule of a few. The true form is aristocracy. The degenerate form is oligarchy. He calls this constitutional government or polity, since polity is shorter. I'll just write down polity, but remember that it's also just called constitutional government. The degenerate form is democracy, where that's thought of as the rule of the poor. Oligarchy is the rule of the rich. This is the rule of the best, if you want to, and the rule of all, I suppose. And what distinguishes, once again, all of the true forms is that those who govern in the interest of all. And what distinguishes all of the degenerate forms is that those who rule, those who govern in the interest of the rulers, of themselves. Okay? Now, if you like, I think Aristotle calls these the true forms, but I think most of us would look at that and say these are sort of idealistic. These are ideal forms. And that's where Aristotle shares some of his teacher Plato's preference for discussing ideals, utopias. Aristotle's a very practical man, though, and so the difference between Plato and Aristotle is that he goes through this whole litany and he talks about all these other things. He wants to talk about not just what's ideal, but also he wants to talk about what's practical, what's achievable. And what he also notices is that, well, what's achievable might vary with circumstances. In some places and some times, with some people, given some skills, some wealth, some resources. I don't know what the whole range of conditions is that he might specify, but sometimes certain forms might be the best forms that are practical. So he doesn't want to sort of pin down one form of government that's the best for everywhere, everyone, always. That's the practical side of Aristotle. The idealistic side, though, is that he feels constrained to say, nevertheless, if we could, for example, if we found in our society some people, one person, let's start this way, if we found one person who was so superior in virtue, remember, virtue means all the excellences, not just right and wrong, but if we had found one person who was superior in virtue to all others, then it would be ludicrous for us to do anything except give this person the government. Right? So ideally, under these very special circumstances, if there was some one person who was superior to everybody else, well, under those circumstances, it would just be dumb for us to sort of play around with aristocracy or constitutional government. We should just hand over, if God came down, you just hand the government over to him and say, here, you take it, take over, because, we don't know what we're doing. You know what you're doing. So in those very, very special circumstances where there's somebody who's eminently, obviously more excellent in these matters than the rest of us, then we would go with something like, a monarchic, a royalty situation. That would be a situation where we have one person who is clearly the wisest, the most just, the most virtuous, the most excellent in all relevant matters, and that would be the ideal under those circumstances. But my reading of Aristotle is that he thinks that that's not likely, or there's more often than not there might be a relatively small number of relatively more virtuous people. In other words, not this ideal situation where someone's sort of godlike, superhuman, but the more realistic situation is one in which there are some people who are more virtuous than others. In that case, then what we really ought to try to do is to get them to be the rulers as a group. And here he talks about how, well, to boil it all down to a nutshell, 2 heads are better than 1, 3 heads are better than 1, many heads, under most realistic circumstances, are better than just 1 in real life. And so I'd have to say, and your editors disagree here, they think he is clearly in favor of royalty. I'd have to say that where Aristotle finally compromises his idealism with his practicality, leads him to come down on the side of aristocracy. He thinks that's the best among practical forms of government. Polity, the rule of all, constitutional government, that would be fine, but it's really, really tough to realize in practice. It degenerates very quickly to democracy, which is the rule of the poor. Aristocracy is at risk of degenerating to oligarchy, which is the rule of the rich. There's a risk there, but again, I think for Aristotle, the risk is relatively less that aristocracy will degenerate to oligarchy than that constitutional government or polity will degenerate to democracy. So if he's got to put his cards on any particular form of government, as a general rule, I think he'd have to say, well, aristocracy's probably got the most going for it, where aristocracy is the rule of the best, the most virtuous people in society. And signs of wisdom in an aristocracy is that the poorer classes are given special favors, special dispensations. Even though they don't get to rule, they're given something special that will sort of help them understand that they really are part of the society and are to be taken into consideration. The best of the constitutional governments, the rule of the largest number, would be ones where, now in these societies, the aristocrats wouldn't be in power in particular, but you give them kind of special protections so as to make sure that they don't have to fear that their wealth will be taken from them, as would be the case in what Aristotle calls democracy, the rule of the poor. Now, the state is natural. I want to just rehearse these things that I emphasized last time. The state is to be understood as the natural expression of the very essence of humanity. The whole point of the state is to seek the good life, where the good life is to be understood as the life that promotes human rationality. And that's what distinguishes the human species from other species, is rationality. So the good life is the rational life, the life in pursuit of wisdom. That's what we form the state for. because it's expressive of this highest aspiration of humanity, this distinguishing feature of humanity, that's what makes the state and its goals more important than the individual goals of individual persons. I mean, it's like this crusade that's bigger than any one of us, right? It's what our species is all about. If you ever think, to be a little bit less Aristotelian about this, if you ever think that individual human lives are supposed to be lived in pursuit of something that's positive for the species or for something bigger than ourselves as individuals, then you partake in this, you're sort of thinking the same way that Aristotle does here. But that's what makes him one of those organic theorists rather than an instrumentalist. As much an instrumentalist as he is inclined to be in thinking that, well, the state has these purposes and these goals, and as much as he cares about functions and goals of everything, as much as he cares about teleology, like what things are for, as important as that is for Aristotle, he still comes down as an organic theorist on the state because the state is something basically more important than the particular values of particular individuals. It's seeking to accomplish goals that are bigger than any one of us. Now, if you like, now here I'm going to try and sort of bend Aristotle a little bit further so I can move over towards Hobbes. I'm going to put these things in quotes just because I want you to remember that I'm characterizing things this way, and I don't know that Aristotle would. But we might say that what is being pursued in those true forms are ideals, and that's what I wanted to do here, just give some names to them. The ideals of justice and right. And that in the degenerate forms, the ideals of justice and right give way to the pursuit of self-interest on the part of those in power. Now, with an eye on this distinction between true forms and degenerate forms of government, distinction between efforts to accomplish justice and right in the social realm versus attempts to just simply solidify one's own standing, one's own self-interest. Think back on one of the first people you read about. And I'm not thinking about Plato, I'm thinking about Thrasymachus. What did Thrasymachus say? First of all, remind me of Thrasymachus' doctrine. The question that came up at the beginning of the Republic, or at least the beginning of the part of the Republic that you read, the question that came up was, what is justice? What did Thrasymachus say?
That which is in the interest of the strongest.
Justice is just that which is in the interest of the strongest. I've tried to interpret Aristotle, and again, I'm pushing Aristotle in this direction, just for pedagogic purposes so we could move into Hobbes more easily. I've tried to characterize Aristotle as distinguishing between government in the interest of justice and right on the one hand, and government or virtue. That's much more the kind of term that Aristotle would have us use, and where virtue is just excellence of all kinds, not just ethical, moral virtue. But I've had Aristotle distinguishing between this side, this kind of form of government, and this kind of form of government in these terms, justice versus the self-interest of the rulers. What does Thrasymachus say about that distinction? It's pretty clear, I think. Huh?
Might makes right.
He says might makes right, all right. He says justice is the interest of the ruling party. Say that, in other words, if you can, about this distinction. I've said justice is opposed. Justice is something different from the interests of the ruling party. Well, I'll say it. Thrasymachus says that's a fake distinction. There is no such distinction. There's no such thing as justice that's definable apart from understanding what the interests of the ruling party may be. Now, where the ruling party is the people, where you have something like constitutional government, democracy, whatever you want to call it, where the many rule, then whatever it is, this is going to be a little bit amorphous, a little bit non-distinct perhaps, but whatever it is that the many take to be just, whatever they assert to be just, that's what will be just. That's what will define justice in that society. That will define the difference between right and wrong. That there is no objective answer to the question, which things are right, which things are wrong, which things are just, which things are unjust. You don't get an answer to that question until you ask yourself, what society are we talking about? And then the answer will turn out to be simply a function of whatever happens to be in the interest of those who are in power, de facto, those who are in fact in power. What Thrasymachus is, what he even to this day, what he calls forth in us is the realist in us. I mean, on the one hand, there's this sort of idealist motivation we have. We can understand Plato's desire to have the best rule. We can understand Aristotle's distinction between true forms and degenerate forms. But I see it in your notes. You are as impatient as Thrasymachus in many cases, as all of us must be from time to time when we're reading people whose political philosophies are basically idealists. We say, wait a minute, that's not how things are. This is all just utopian. Fact is, this is what Thrasymachus says anyway, justice cannot be distinguished from the interests of the ruling party. Justice is defined by the interests of whoever happens to be in power. And you go from society to society, you'll see different criteria of right and wrong, different principles of justice, and that's because as you go from society to society, they have different histories, they have different people in power. Justice is a function of power, according to this apparently pragmatic, practical, down-to-earth way of thinking. That's the way the Thrasymachus of the world would describe it. That's the way we would describe it when we're feeling like Thrasymachus. When we're not feeling so much like Thrasymachus, when we're feeling more like Plato or Aristotle on their idealistic sides, then we're inclined to call such people cynics. But there's a little bit of the cynic in all of us. I mean, there's the idealist. We would like things to be a certain way. We're prepared sometimes to work hard to make things a certain way. But when we're discouraged, and we fall back and say, Thrasymachus is right. I mean, we won't put it that way, but all it really is power relations. That's all. Now, Hobbes. You need to know that, first of all, I should look this up since I don't know the exact date. I was about to do that, and I wanted to find it out. Does anyone remember when it was that the Leviathan, it appeared in 1651. I like this. The screen worked better that way. Okay, I put 1651 down here. What do you know from American history about what's going on in and around England during the first half of the 17th century? Anything? Just want to see where you are. Know anything at all about England? 1620s, 1610s? What's happening in the United States in that period?
Revolutionary War.
No.
Way off.
When's the Revolutionary War in the United States? Huh? When's the Revolutionary War in the United States? 1776 was when it finally is a Declaration of Independence, but there's a little bit of war for a couple of years before that, and it extends beyond. But Declaration of Independence of 1776, and that's a good mark to help you remember where the Revolutionary War came in. So that's like 125 years after 1651 and the publication of the Leviathan. What is going on? What do you? The key things are happening in the United States. Does the date 1620 ring a bell at all? Plymouth Rock. Okay. Colonists are just starting to come over. What kind of colonists are coming over?
Pilgrims.
Huh?
Pilgrims.
Pilgrims. I thought you said Polish. I was saying, no. It didn't happen much later. That's when my grandparents came over. But, so the Pilgrims were coming over. What are Pilgrims?
Religious outcasts.
Huh?
Religious outcasts.
Religious outcasts from
England.
England. Thank you. From about 1603 on in England, right up through 1650s anyway, that whole first half of the 17th century is a time when Europe and England, and the reasons are different in the two cases, but they're just in complete turmoil. It's just war everywhere. From 1603 on, I think the king who came to power in 1603 was James. From 1603 on, there was almost no peace in England. Either there was active war, active revolution, or there was a state of war when people were disposed to fight, when people were suspicious of one another, like a Cold War in England and on the European continent for that whole first half of the 17th century. No real peace in England at all. In particular, I've got some dates here I want to make sure that I put down properly. In England, there was a Puritan revolution. Civil War. You can number them in a variety of ways. Maybe 2 different civil wars, at least, were waged between something like 1640 and 1649. In that latter year, 1649, the King of England, King Charles, overthrown and beheaded. A very serious declaration against the idea of the divine right of kings. Hobbes himself was exiled after about 1640. He was a partisan of good old King Charles. He didn't come back to England until about 1651, but around just before Charles was executed, in 1649, Hobbes had been the tutor to Charles's son, who much later came back to occupy the throne. But I guess what I want to emphasize is that in England, there was just no peace whatsoever. It was a very long period in which there was war after war after war. There were religious issues involved. There were issues that were economic, basically. There was the whole question as to whether a parliament should be in power or whether a monarch should be in power. So questions about monarchy versus aristocracy, basically. But the parliament, I think it's probably best to say that the parliament was not exactly an aristocracy. It wasn't who was on what side was a little difficult to predict if you were looking at the nobility. But what was emerging was a strong middle class, and the middle class favored the parliament. In Europe, just to keep this all in perspective, on the continent from 1618 to 1648, for a period of 30 years, there was the 24 Years' War. No, it's called the 30 Years' War, right? Which pretty much entirely destroyed Germany, where most of the war was fought. It wasn't that Germany was doing all the fighting, it's just that that's where they decided to hold it. This destroyed Germany. That's the period in which a good deal of the colonization of the United States took place. People were fleeing Europe, England in particular, because of religious persecution, but they were also fleeing these horrible, impossible situations. Constant war, like Bosnia now. Same reasons people flee Rwanda, Bosnia. People had reason to flee Europe at that time, and that's a good part of the reason for people's coming here. Religious persecution was an interesting part of it, but also interestingly, when people came over to free themselves from the religious persecution in England, they frequently set up little societies in which they then persecuted everybody else. Now they had their own society, so they were free to persecute other people. In any case, that's the situation that we were up against. A very difficult time for idealists to flourish. A very easy time for cynics, for people who think of themselves as practical, who think of themselves as down to earth when it comes to politics. Much more easy for those people to flourish. And that's, I think, a large part of why, not only why Hobbes is what he is, why Hobbes wrote what he wrote, but it's why Hobbes became popular, well-read, widely respected, even though half the time he was being exiled, another quarter of the time his books were being banished by somebody. His collected works weren't published in England first, they were published in Holland. He certainly was not a great respecter of religion, and his name became synonymous with atheism regardless of what he really believed, and I'm not sure about what he believed in terms of whether he thought there were gods or not, but he did not think that religious institutions should be as powerful as the government. He thought that was a tremendous risk. And you can see why. It led to all this. The worst fate that can befall any society, according to Hobbes, is civil war. Civil war raged the whole time. It's the very worst thing that can happen to you. And when you get civil war, it's when you got a weak government. What you need is a strong government. Nothing else matters. What human beings need is a strong government that will control this urge of theirs to fight. Now, he did not think that human nature was bleak, surprisingly enough. He thought human nature was quite neutral. He constructed this theory that's in the Leviathan, which you've read part of, on the basis of, and I'm pretty sure that this is wholly eliminated from the part that's excerpted in the book, but he founds his whole political philosophy on a rather interesting theory of human psychology. He may be one of the first people to sort of set out a theory of human psychology in just these terms. He's trying to analyze people as they are, not as anyone wants them to be, not as anyone hopes that they will be. And what he suggests is that in what he calls the state of nature, that is, without government, if there weren't any government, you could see what people are quite clearly. People have desires. People have differences in their abilities, differences in the strength of their desires. They differ in all kinds of different ways, but everybody has certain basic things that they desire. And when they achieve those things, the desire doesn't go away. Then they want more stuff. And so for Hobbes, human life is a constant attempt to fulfill one's desires, and then on the basis of the now fulfilled desires to move forward and fulfill more desires. And if we lived in a world where that was just overloaded with the things that fulfill people's desires, there'd be no problem. But we've got a finite number of people in any normal space, all trying to fulfill their desires, and the things that fulfill human desires are going to be in relatively short supply. And human beings, as dissimilar as they may be, at least are this similar, that from time to time, more than one person will desire the same thing and they both can't have it. So what they'll both try to do is to see if they can figure out a way to get it. Now, in a state of nature, this is just like a situation, think about the situation animals find themselves in. We are animals in the same sense. We have desires, we have capacities, we try to fulfill our desires, we try to protect ourselves. It is, if there's any kind of a natural liberty or anything that even smacks of justice in the state of nature, for Hobbes, and we're going to suggest that there's really nothing in the state of nature that really resembles justice. But the closest thing that comes to it is that each person certainly is at liberty to do whatever they can to protect themselves and to seek out the fulfillment of their needs, whatever those might be. And people are free to do what they can. And what's going to stop people is well, there's going to be natural obstacles, but there's also going to be human obstacles. There's going to be somebody over there who's got more power than I, and I better not go over there because I'm going to get beat up if I try and get some of that stuff that's that person's. There's no such thing as property rights. There's no such thing as rights to free speech, to free anything in the state of nature. This stuff only arises when human beings form societies. That naturally speaking, there's no such thing as right and wrong, except that that obviously people. There's nothing in the state of nature that can give any person any reason to sacrifice themselves or to do any less than the maximum to get what they need and want to fulfill their lives. That's that's the natural state. Now, did this state ever really exist? What we're in the middle of here, what I'm beginning to explore, is what's called state of nature theory. We got a little sample of this when we looked at Plato, and Plato was saying stuff like, well, people come together to form common groups because of the benefits of the division of labor. That kind of presumes a background in which people hadn't come together yet. And Aristotle also talks about how people always come together and they form groups and they cooperate with one another for good ends, things that they regard as good. They always come together to try to do something, to accomplish something that they regard as good. And then, of course, the state for Aristotle is the vehicle, the entity that's supposed to help us pursue the utmost, the highest good. But in each of those cases, you get a little bit of a presumption that, well, maybe there was this situation prior to the development of societies and prior to the development of the state. There must have been some sort of situation in which there wasn't any of this stuff. And people then came together to win the advantages of cooperation. And Hobbes certainly sometimes talks that way too, as if this is some sort of historical analysis, that one time, way, way back in the dim and dark prehistoric periods, individuals were wandering around all by themselves, or maybe, I suppose you'd at least have to have, occasionally paired individuals if the species is to survive. Someone pointed that out here. But in any case, that you didn't have social groups. Nowhere is it necessary for Hobbes or for Plato or for Aristotle or for anyone else who tries to talk this way. It's not really necessary that this be a historical thesis. There may never have been a time. There may never have been a time when humans or ape-like predecessors of humans really existed in an isolated, atomistic environment, and then they later came together. The value of this kind of analysis, if it has any value at all, is supposed to be this. We're trying to figure out what's the point of government. What kind of government should we have? That's Hobbes' point for sure. He's in the middle. He's offering the Leviathan. He's offering this book as a contribution in an ongoing argument among people, some of whom think that the monarchy is a good thing, some of whom think the monarchy is a relatively bad thing. We should instead have a parliament. He's trying to offer this as a contribution in an ongoing discussion of how government should be like, what the state should be like. And the point of the state of nature idea is to say, well, in order to find out what it should be like, let's figure out what the situation would be if we didn't have a government. Now for Hobbes, what that means is that you'd have everybody would be everybody else's throat, basically. In the state of nature, each person would be struggling to make the best life they could for themselves. That would mean that they'd probably have small family units anyway. You'd have those kinds of alliances, or else the species doesn't have a chance to get off the ground. So let's postulate we've got some kind of maybe ephemeral families. There's no marriage institution. We've got some kind of at least ephemeral couplings of family units. And so those units and the individuals in them have some reason not just to protect themselves, but to protect perhaps their partner, their children. Maybe they've worked hard to construct some sort of dwelling. Maybe they've even begun to try to till the land. But without some sort of institutionalized principles of right and wrong, without institutionalized justice, and remember we're trying to picture what things would be like without government, other people down the road would have no particular reason to keep their hands off of anything that this nice little family has produced. They'd say to themselves, they got corn up there. They're growing corn. I'm going to go get that. You know, that's great. What a lucky break for me. Corn. If they can protect their land from me, well then I'll leave them alone. But you know, if they're presuming that they don't have sufficient strength to hold me off, maybe I can sneak up there and get some corn some evening. Or they build that nice house. I'd like that house. I don't really want to put all the work in making one myself. The easiest way, the most cost-effective way for me to acquire that house might very well be to drive those people out, murder them even, or enslave them. Then they could work the land for me too. Now there's a practical solution. I've got a lot of strength here. The best thing for me to do here, the most cost-effective, efficient way for me to meet my needs are to go up there, conquer that family that's put together that nice little farm, take over the farm, you know, kick them out into the little barn that they've been using for the animals, but keep them around so that they, you know, enslave them so that they keep growing the crops. Now, without principles of right and wrong, that's the state of nature. You know, that's what I would do. It'd be just like animals. You can't blame animals for attacking their prey. This is what would be the situation. And the guy on the farm now, think about this. The family or the person on the farm has a couple of different options too. He could say, look, I mean, foreseeing that others might want to come and steal all this stuff, he can say, well, I'm not going to go through all the trouble of plowing the land here, because somebody's just going to come along and steal it, unless and until I can figure out some way to protect it. Now, maybe the guy up there on the farm would say, now, that guy down there at the hill, he's not making a farm, but he seems to be amassing power. I know what he's going to do. He's going to come up here and grab my stuff. He's going to try and grab my stuff, and maybe he'll kill us or enslave us or something. And I'm not sure that I can hold him off if I wait for him to build up all of his power. My best bet, now remember, this is the peace-loving farmer up there who's been trying to make just a place for his family. The peace-loving farmer is likely to say, my best bet, since I don't really know for sure what that guy's going to do, I better preemptively attack. If I have a little bit of power now, if I can cut down the threat now before the threat is ever mounted, then my best bet is to do it. Hobbes suggested that in the absence of government, in the state of nature, it's a constant state of war of all against all. Even where people form temporary alliances, there still is what Hobbes thought of as the sense of diffidence between the two. You always have to worry, you know, how long that person's going to abide by this agreement. You make an agreement with somebody, a deal, you don't hurt me, I won't hurt you, or we cooperate. You know, they'll cooperate only as long as there's an interest to do so. In the state of nature, very few significant projects would be undertaken by people because of the risk that all of their work would be in vain. Nothing, there'd be no industry, no real agriculture. Certainly nothing like art or culture, nothing like that. Life, according to Hobbes, would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And while everybody in the state of nature could see, boy, it would be great if we could just achieve peace, achieving peace is not an easy thing to do. Achieving peace would mean laying down your sword, laying down your gun, whatever you've got, laying down your power, and trusting the other person to do the same. In the state of nature, no one's going to do that, no matter how nice the promises, no matter how nice the contracts seem. No one's going to just trust the contracts. According to Hobbes, it's in people's interests, and it's reasonable for them to try to make peace as much as they can, but peace isn't easy to make. And it's not reasonable for anybody to lay down the sword unless they have assurances that the other person isn't going to come attack them. Now, what I want you to consider is not just this sort of hypothetical about what things would be like without government, because you don't need a hypothetical. You've got a real-life example of the state of nature. First of all, Hobbes might point to England in the first half of the 17th century. We might point to Bosnia. We might point to some of those examples, at least short-lived examples of situations that look like the state of nature, where there's no dominant power that's able to quell the fighting between the individuals. But you don't have to go that far. The state of nations with respect to one another, international affairs, is exactly like that. Nations make contracts with one another, but they're still diffident about the contracts. They are not going to just say, well, the Russians promised so-and-so, so I guess we don't have to worry at all. No. What we learned in the Cold War, for example, is the best defense is the strongest offense we can possibly mount. And that's the way things are in the state of nature, and that's the state of nature characterizes international relationships. To this day, Hobbes says that's what would characterize interpersonal relationships if there weren't any government. It would be civil war of the deadliest and bloodiest sort. I can't emphasize strongly enough something that I said perhaps too briefly before. Hobbes is not saying that human nature is ugly or mean or bleak. He's not saying that in the state of nature we would finally see that human nature would lead people to be murderous villains. He doesn't think of human nature that way. People are not, according to Hobbes, naturally immoral. That's the wrong way to understand Hobbes. And yet he does say, that in the state of nature, the life of man would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. People would be at each other's throats. It would be a war of all against all. Now, how can you that's the thing I want to work with. I think I'd like to ask you to tell me how you can put these two things together. On the one hand, he emphatically does not say that human nature is naturally bad or immoral. On the other hand, in the state of nature, where we do see human nature revealed, the result would be this horrible state of affairs. There'd be no industry, no agriculture, no civilization. Short, miserable lives for everyone. How do you put those things together? You have the information at your disposal. I know that. How?
Well, it seems that it's human nature to form into states or to form a government, not to be in this natural state of just like anarchy where everyone is killing each other.
There is a sense in which the state of nature naturally leads to the state. That's not, though, the answer that I think is the best answer to my question. You're not wrong. You're not wrong. I don't believe that leave that impression. There's a natural movement, according to Hobbes, toward the state. Indeed, toward quite a strong state. But how, in the state of nature, before this natural movement, we've got, he plainly means to portray how things would be given what humanity is like, given what human beings are like. Here's what we see if there were no government. And the portrait is of a situation where people are at each other's throats. And yet I'm claiming he does not think that human nature is immoral, bad, blameworthy, unjust, mean, vicious, nothing like that. And we've discussed already, you have the answer at hand. How can you put those two things together? How can human nature not be bad if that's what you get? I'll give you a hint. A key to human nature for Hobbes is, just as it was, especially for Aristotle, but also for Plato, the key to human nature is to understand human beings as essentially rational creatures, where in this case, reason, you have to be very cautious about these words. They're bandied about, they're used in all kinds of different ways in English. But we're talking about reason here, especially for Hobbes. We're talking about picking the right means to achieve your ends. The wisest means to achieve your ends. Reason is basically an instrumental faculty. Goals that we choose have to do with our desires, our interests, our needs. That's the goals that we're presented with. This is all part of his human psychology. He bases his political theory, as I said, on a psychological theory. But the psychology doesn't say that human beings are bad. In fact, human beings are just doing what they need to do to achieve their desires, their goals, their wants, and there's nothing wrong or bad or immoral about their desires, their goals, or their wants. Those are just facts. People have wants. And when they achieve if they manage to achieve the wants that they have on day one, the wants aren't going to go away. They'll have new ones. They'll have new desires. They'll want new things. Accomplishing the old desires will, in fact, create new desires. That's just the way people are. That's part of animal nature, as a matter of fact. It's not just human beings. That's all. The entire animal world is like that. But with humans, when it may just be that the desiring goes on longer, it has a richer depth to it, and the human means of accomplishing human ends involves the use of reason. Reason is a practical device. Now, since I have, let's take me, I have certain desires, then what reason is going to tell me is how I can accomplish those best. So what you find in nature is, in the state of nature, what you find is human beings exercising their reason in pursuit of their goals and their desires. And one of their desires is to live in peace, because it's peace that seems to be required if you really want to enjoy your life, to really have your desires fulfilled. So one of the natural desires is to get peace. And yet that's not what you get. How come? Think it through. You get this evil, awful situation. Yeah.
Would it be conflicting desires?
A little louder.
Conflicting desires?
Conflicting desires, make that a little clearer. There could be conflicts within a person or conflicts between people. Let's just work this through. Let's just talk this through. Okay, you're exactly right. You're going to have desires. Different people will have conflicting desires. But so what? Why is that going to lead us to a war of all against all?
Peace is one desire, but you got to be able to survive and live and get your basic needs in order to be peaceful. You got to start by surviving, and maybe all those conflicts are like the rudimentary, basic survival things. Like I need to eat, I need to live, and before you can even think about peace, you need to accomplish all those things, and all those conflicts have.
Well, peace. All right. I'm going to play devil's advocate here because I think you guys can all. I think you can work through very well yourself, just like Hobbes did, because you've read enough about Hobbes. You see how he thinks. Well, why can't? All right, you and me and the rest of us, we're all trying to establish these basic desires. We want to eat. We want to live comfortably. We want to procreate. We want to have a good time. We want to live nice lives. And there are some resources around. Why can't we just get along? Why can't we just get along? I mean, why can't we just sit down and say, look, this war is terrible. This is awful. Let's all just compromise. Let's just, let's all realize that no one of us can get everything we might want. Let's just use our heads, our reason. Let's just realize that, that we should make a deal to cooperate. Why can't we do that? The best way of thinking through this matter is to remember a key thing I said before, and that's that a good model for the state of nature is the situation in the international arena. You've got nation states that would all, you would think, profit from peace. And yet, peace has been very difficult to come by. You think of the situation in Bosnia. I mean, this is almost like a Hobbesian state of nature. Not right now in Bosnia, but has been in recent years. Think about the situation in the Middle East. You would think that the people involved there, and even the politicians, except for maybe a few crazy exceptions, but whether it's that the people involved there, and maybe even the politicians, could indeed profit from peace, that they're not profiting, even as politicians, as much as they might, if they could really achieve peace. Because the benefits of peace are pretty great. So, again, with some exceptions, you can imagine that most people, and then I think we have to take those exceptions into account because they are real, live human phenomena. So even in the international arena, the Saddam Husseins have to be taken into account. You have to figure, all right, they're out there in the world. How come they don't make peace? Why haven't we had peace always? Why have we just instead had a history that's filled with war after war after war, and the minute we establish peace, some new way of making war is figured out? Why does that happen? Yeah.
There's a lack of trust.
Lack of trust. Now, is that something silly? This lack of trust? I mean, why don't people, nation states or individuals in the Hobbesian state of nature, why don't they just sit down at the table, sign the deals, shake hands, make friends? Why doesn't Netanyahu and Arafat, why don't they sit down and make a deal? Why don't all the leaders of the countries in the Balkans, why don't they all just sit down and make friends, sign a deal, and live happily ever after? You're exactly right. They don't trust one another. Are they dumb to not trust one another? They've got every reason to not trust one another. Now, just you must know this, no matter what your positions are on any of these conflicts in the world, you must realize that there's a story told about, say, the Soviet, let's go back to the Cold War to take a non-contemporary example. There's a story that is told and believed by the people within the Soviet Union about their behavior. And then there's a story that's told in the United States about Soviet behavior. Similarly, there's stories and interpretations and beliefs about how the United States acts that are dominant in the United States, but outside the United States, especially in countries that think of them that are antagonistic to the United States, it's an entirely different understanding of United States behavior. Now, is this the product of unreason? No, it's people being cautious, people understanding past events in the light of what's important to them. Now think about you and your friends. Think about relationships you have with other people, whether they're here at RIT, at home. Think about how easy it is to misunderstand, misinterpret, to be misunderstood, to be misinterpreted. People are naturally cautious, even in a world that's dominated mostly by peace, the world that we live in here. Even here, we are naturally cautious. We are naturally a little bit suspicious about other people. The stakes aren't as high. We don't necessarily think that we're going to be killed by them. But in the Hobbesian state of nature, where there is nothing, no law enforcement, nothing like that, people are going to be all the more suspicious, all the more worried about making arrangements. Sure, it would be nice if we could make an agreement, but as Hobbes says, agreements that are not backed by the sword are no agreements at all, or they're worthless. So it's in everybody's interest to have peace. It's in everybody's interest to come around and agree to have peace. But it's in nobody's interest to sign away their ability to defend themselves in the hope that the other person will abide by the agreement, in the trust that the other person will abide by that agreement. People won't do that. And that's why we don't get peace in the world. That's why the move from the state of nature to civil society is an extraordinarily touchy one. You see that? It's a different situation if you're not in the state of nature. If you've got a police force, you might say, well, you know, they're not really very good at protecting us. There's an awful lot of crime out there. But there's something about them, you know, no matter how bad you think they do their job, there's at least something that's done. They do, you know, they really, the presence of the police, the presence of the armed forces, however it happens, maybe it's there's a huge psychological effect, but it does promote peace. Now imagine if that wasn't there. Now I want you to be cautious here. I don't happen to agree with Hobbes about this, personally. This is not my position about what the state of nature would be like, and we'll see other people's portrayals. But my job here with you is to try and represent Hobbes's case as best I can, because it'd be too easy to dismiss it. And there's too many people today who agree 100% with Hobbes. They say, yeah, you get rid of all these background institutions that provide us with a substantial amount of protection. You get rid of those institutions, and it's just as Hobbes says. It's not because people are bad that they would be at each other's throats. It's because people need to defend themselves, and they'll do what they must to defend their interests, no matter what that may mean. People that aren't prepared to do that will simply be eliminated in the state of nature. That's exactly the words that you can expect to get from any of those political leaders that I've mentioned before. Their people would regard them as irresponsible, not doing their jobs. And this has been shown case after case after case on almost every side of every dispute. If somebody relaxes the vigilance for a moment, they're regarded as soft, as weak, as not representing their people's interests. They will not survive politically if they let that vigilance down. And they may not survive. They may be assassinated. They may literally be killed if their people regard them as not attending to their interests. Now, this is the situation that Hobbes sees as being the natural state of humanity. It's not because people are evil. It's not because they want to murder. It's because that's what they have to do in their self-defense. And if there's one liberty that can't be taken away from people, no matter what, even for Hobbes, who finally licenses a totalitarian monarchy, actually, as the best form of government, one thing that is impossible to take away, it's not a question of justice, it's just you can't take it away, is a person's readiness, I hesitate to use the word right, a person's readiness to defend himself if his life is in jeopardy. Nothing can make that reasonable. Nothing can make it reasonable for a person to be prepared to give up his life for the sake of a possible peace. Okay. Comments on that? Discussion? Now, this is the person then we're supposed to be looking at when we're thinking about the natural human being in the state of nature is what might be called in the present era a rational maximizer. It's somebody who's trying to figure out how to maximize his or her personal well-being, given the conditions. And reason is the tool you use to try and figure out how to marshal what resources you've got to maximize your situation.
Do you think that our tendency not to trust is something that's learned, or is that inborn?
I don't know that much hangs one way or another on whether it's learned or whether it's inborn. Learned is my own personal suggestion.
Kids naturally trust mothers first and foremost, but parents, it seems to me, are naturally dependent. Human infants are naturally dependent when they come into the world. And it may be that whatever people learn about the potential of being betrayed in the world is something that comes on the back of a presupposition that the world is going to be kind and gentle. But it's not just people. I mean, as you grow up, as you're a child and as you grow up, plainly, you're betrayed not just by people, you're betrayed by the world. And what betrayal amounts to is just when the world doesn't live up to your expectations. It may not be the world's fault. It may not be the people's fault. People that you think of as betraying you, even as adults, if you think back, sometimes it's just because you had built up a certain expectation that they may not have cared to generate in you. Right? They may not have particularly meant that you should have this expectation, but you did. You just built up an expectation. You built up a feeling about what you should expect from the person. And when the person didn't do it, well, our reaction is to feel betrayed. It puts a niche in that in our ability to trust. So it might be the sense in which it's natural is not that we have an inborn sense of distrust, but it's natural that if you come into the world thinking, the world is your oyster, it's just going to give you a ride, and it's just there to be milked, and everything is abundant, and you're going to be disappointed, right? It's just not going to go along with your expectations, and that's going to maybe generate a distrust. So while distrust is not inborn as such, the likelihood that we would become suspicious, that our suspicions would be supported by our experiences, that's pretty likely. Does that make sense to you? I mean, what do you think? I
I'm just curious about your view.
Yeah. As I say, I'm not ever clear on these questions about, they come up in countless different areas of philosophy. I'm never clear about these, is it inborn or is it learned sorts of questions. I find that not terribly much hangs on it. It's very difficult to sort of perform, as you may know, the kinds of experiments that you would need to perform in order to ascertain most of these nature-nurture sorts of questions. It's very difficult to run tests that are convincing on any of them, even things that would seem like you'd be able to figure out pretty clearly. So, I don't know. But anyway, that's Hobbes' position. It's not that people are immoral, it's that people are reasonable in assessing, in trying to, and their reason leads them to try to maximize their well-being as best they can, given the circumstances they're in. They would like peace. They would very much like peace. They will, it's in fact one of the, it's right there in with food and the basic necessities. I mean, because you can't really hope to have a reliable means of providing yourself with a living unless there's some peace. So it's right in there among the most basic needs that we've got. But it's just hard to get. And what peace you might be able to get in that state of nature would be short-lived. Until such time as people began to feel that they're being taken advantage of by the contract, by the arrangement, by the agreement, it might work. But that will happen. In any agreement, there'll come a time when somebody is profiting more than other people. And the people who aren't profiting as much are going to feel, why should I stay in this agreement again? I can't remember. Is it because I gave my word? That's silly. All right. So what we need is a way of getting out of this state of nature. And as I was about to say, a good deal of modern economics, a good deal, certainly game and decision theory, is based on the idea of interpreting human beings as sort of Hobbesian, rational maximizers. What is it? People's behavior is explained not in terms of what oughts, not in terms of values. People's behavior a lot can be done. I don't know if I agree with those who think that this is all there is to really the explanation of human behavior. But it's amazing how much can be done in explaining human behavior just by imagining that people are motivated to try and fulfill their desires, and they will use what information they have to fulfill those desires, and that's it. They will adopt even the ideals and the persona that is required in order for them to achieve their ideals. Even those decisions, they may not be consciously made, but that's just almost an automatic feature of human life, is that people do what they need to do to achieve their desires in the cheapest, most efficient way, given the resources that they have at their disposal, given the information that they've got. That's a Hobbesian characterization of human behavior. It seems down to earth, it seems pragmatic. It certainly doesn't seem very idealistic, but as we said, Hobbes didn't live in times that allowed for the nurturance very much of idealism about politics. All right, so here he's writing this stuff after a half century of war, civil war, international war. He's trying to be as practical as he can, but he's considering, what it is that we need. What is it that we need that will prevent this? For Hobbes, the very, very worst situation that can befall a society is civil war. It's to have a civil war is to collapse back into the state of nature. That's what's happened in England. That's what's happened everywhere, is that society, according to him, in the 17th century had collapsed back into the state of nature. And the reason for its collapse back into the state of nature is because the institutions that it tried to use to climb out of the war of all against all were just simply not sufficient for the purpose. I mean, you need to try to make sure that you set up a system that won't immediately dissolve back into another massive conflict. So for him, the idea that seems maybe natural to us in the United States after 200 years of a different kind of experience. Of course, we had our Civil War too, but for him, the idea that the power of the state should be divided among branches or among different persons or offices just seemed insane. He says, if you want a civil war, you just go ahead and do that. I mean, you say, you've got half the power and you've got half the power. What are they going to do? They're going to fight. They're going to try and get all the power. You don't want to divide the power. What you want to do is to try and set up a power that is sufficient to quash all rebellion, that's sufficient to stop all civil war. So for him, the idea is, now it's useless for you and me to say, let's just stop fighting. Let's just try to get along. That's just a useless thing for us to imagine will succeed. It'll succeed for a while as long as it's in both of our interests. But the minute one of us begins to feel that the other one's taking advantage or gets suspicious that the other one might take advantage, we'll break the contract. We'll do it because we'll think we need to preserve ourselves. But what can we do? Suggestions? Or do you think, maybe you think he's wrong? I mean, do you think that could work? We're in the state of nature now. There's nobody to turn to. No courts. We can't sue. What do we do? Nothing. Anything? Well, he says that we, our best bet is indeed to make an agreement, but not just something as wishy-washy as, let's just stop our silly fighting. Nothing as wishy-washy as that. What we agree to is whatever arms that we've got, weapons, whatever means we have to undertake the war of all against all. I mean, you can imagine primitive situations in which there's not much in the way of weapons at all, or you can imagine much more elaborate situations, more modern situations in which there's all kinds of weaponry. But imagine whatever you like, swords, knives. What we agree to is, and then there's also resources, money. We have maybe lots of property. We could actually use that to build our power. Whatever resources we have to preserve ourselves, we make an agreement to give at least a sizable portion. Actually, Hobbes says the agreement might go, let's give all of our power, all of our weapons, all of the rights over all of our resources, let's give that to one single person, to Dan. Okay. Every one of us. Now, Dan isn't really party to this agreement. We're just going to give this stuff to Dan. And we know what Dan's interest is. It doesn't matter who we pick. Actually, it does. We'll come back to what the considerations are that you would use. We know that the person who gets these resources will say, yo, that's great. Consolidate resources and maybe enslave the rest of us, but whatever it is, use the power to promote his or her own interest. That's what that person will do. That person, you're not picking out somebody. As a matter of fact, it would be bad. Here are some of the considerations that I think Hobbes would offer. It wouldn't be particularly a good idea to try and figure the nicest, mildest mannered, kindest person. That's not the person we give the power to. What's our purpose? Our purpose is to stop civil war. We want to give a sizable hunk. We may agree to give all of our resources to this person, but each of us is going to secretly reserve a cache of weapons back here. We're not going to give up all of our power, but we're going to say that. We're going to say we're going to give, each of us and we're going to have to give something in order to make it seem like we're complying with the agreement. We'll give it to Dan, and Dan will, since he's getting a big chunk of power from each one of us, he's going to have a huge chunk when he's all done. He's going to have an awful lot of power. We're trying to give him enough power so that if any one of us, or even if any coalition of us, then tried to start civil wars, he'd be in a position to stop us. We want to make him strong so he can stop anybody, even a big bunch of us. That's our point here. The whole point is to put a stop to civil war. Anything is better than that. So maybe the criterion we should use is not kindness and meekness and justice. The person that we want is the person who's going to be most effective. Maybe the person who's already proven himself to be extraordinarily effective in amassing power and protecting his own interests or her own interests. We'll pick that person, give that person yet more power. And our understanding is, among ourselves, is that we're doing this in order to stop the fights among us. We know that that person is now, has limitless power. And as far as Hobbes is concerned, this isn't a question of, the agreement isn't going to be abided to because it's right to abide by the agreement. There's no such thing as right. We've got self-interests. The reason, the thing is going to be abided by, this compact, if we do it right, if we actually give an effective wielder of power, give that person enough power to stop us from fighting. That's what will keep us from fighting. And that's what we're doing when we establish civil society. Leviathan is what we establish. The mortal God, the closest thing to God on earth, is what we're trying to establish. We're establishing a sovereign power. A power that is unbounded. The person to whom we give the power has not entered into a contract. We've not contracted with that person. This is social contract theory, a version of it, which isn't the kind that goes, the people, the citizens, have a contract with the government to do X, Y, and Z. No. This social contract theory, one of the very first versions of social contract theory, Thomas Hobbes' version, says that the contract is among the subjects. It's we subjects who contract among ourselves to give all power to one single, this is best. He sometimes says, well, maybe it would work with a small number of people. But it's best if you give all of this power to one person so that there aren't going to be factions in the government fighting with one another, recreating civil war. Try and solidify and unify all power in one sovereign, then that sovereign will do what he or she can to increase his or her wealth. That's what's likely with that sovereign. The sovereign will want to protect the wealth, so the sovereign will want to keep the peace. The sovereign won't want to eliminate us because we are sources of tax money. We are sources of further wealth. So the sovereign will kind of want to keep us happy enough so we can go on and we do the sorts of things that Hobbes thinks imagines that people want to do. They want to establish civil society. They want to be industrious. They want to get fairly wealthy themselves. Well, the sovereign will establish conditions within which we can live pretty good lives, and if he's a smart, clever sovereign, he'll want us to grow the economy so that he can tax it and get richer and more powerful himself. If the sovereign's got a head on his shoulders, or her shoulders, its soul, we call the sovereign now as Leviathan, the god, refer to it as it. If the sovereign has got a head on its shoulders, it'll not only keep the peace, but it'll, by preventing war, civil war, but it'll also create conditions in which industry can thrive, agriculture can thrive, luxuries can thrive. The production of luxuries is something that the sovereign will want for himself. People will have to produce those. He doesn't want to go out and dig his own swimming pools. He doesn't want to go out and create his own luxurious cuisines and architectures. I mean, he'll want to have those things, but he'll have to encourage the building of a society in which those things can be constructed. Now, it's interesting. Not so much, I talked before about how you shouldn't necessarily understand Hobbesian theory of the state of nature as being historical. It's not necessarily the case. He doesn't anyway put much confidence or doesn't put much weight on the idea that at one point in time there really was a state of nature out of which people emerged. He doesn't necessarily mean it that way. He means the state of nature is a hypothetical gimmick where we can figure out, well, we can sort of, knowing what we know about human nature, and he tries to tell us what we know about human nature, and I tried to outline some of those things today. Knowing what we know about human nature, what would we expect to happen if there were no government? Considering that question will help us see what the point of government is, and also will help us understand what the government should be like. So he doesn't put much stock in the historical possibility that maybe there really was a state of nature, but it's an interesting thing to contemplate in looking back on the history of civilization. To wonder if maybe he's not onto something historically after all, not necessarily about the origin of the state, but in the growth of civilizations, it's frequently been the case that it's been some despot, some monarch, plainly trying simply to build usually his, sometimes her own wealth and power. That's what's established those civilizations and societies that produced the great works of art, the great cultures, the great religions, the great philosophies, that the kings and the tyrants and the conquerors are the ones that have established the great civilizations. This is the great Western political thinkers. This particular tradition is very much owes a great deal to conquest. For example, the conquests of Aristotle's student, Alexander the Great, are what first put Europeans, or at least Mediterranean Europeans, on the map of the world as potential influencers. If it weren't for that great Hellenic conquest, then it's not clear that the Roman conquests would have been quite what they became. And Greece, of course, is the source of these great philosophical views that we are entertaining, or at least have been entertaining in the last couple of weeks. Maybe we wouldn't have worried about them had Alexander the Great not done his conquering. If somebody instead had conquered him, we might be learning somebody else's philosophies and not these. But I don't think that many of the conquerors and despots and tyrants that sprinkle the history of civilization, I don't think that their goals were frequently much more than acquiring, preserving, and expanding power for themselves. So there might be some glimmering of something historically interesting in this Hobbesian theory, even though that's not necessarily what he cares about most. This is a philosophical tool, not a historical tool. All right, so what we need is whatever is the most efficient system at preventing civil war, because civil war is the great evil that we're trying to avoid. Democracy won't prevent civil war. Divisions of power won't prevent civil war. According to Hobbes, what we need to do is to concentrate the power to make sure that no one can reinvigorate civil war. All right, it's vital that you see that the sovereign is not bound by this agreement. The agreement's basis is really force. The basis for the agreement is just that, the Hobbesian agreement to establish civil government, is that this is a practical way of ending this awful situation. It's a pragmatic solution. Here is how we can escape the state of nature. Here's how we can escape the war of all against all. It's by establishing the Leviathan, a sovereign power, able to that we give it whatever power it needs to ensure that the civil war stops. And that will create peace. There will be risks. But all of this stuff, peace, risks, power, this isn't the language of morality, of justice, of right, or of wrong. All of these things, as we've mentioned, for Hobbes, come up only after Leviathan is established. And here's the Thrasymacheian theme again. For Hobbes, now, questions of what's just and what's unjust, questions of what's right and what's not right, are to be equated with what the sovereign says. What's just is what's in the interest of the strongest party. Might really does make right. If you happen to live in a democratic society, then indeed, or something like a democratic society, a democratic republic of the kind that we live in, well, then Hobbes would say, well, if the sovereignty really rests with the people, if it really does, then in that kind of society, what the people think is what would be right. But that's a special case. There's no independent standard here. Whoever has the power makes the laws. And the laws become the standards of right and wrong and justice and injustice. But a corollary of that, you see, since it's whatever the sovereign says that's the law, there's no logical way. This isn't just a matter of if you go along within that far, that's the source of justice and injustice, is whoever it is that makes the standards in society, then the maker of the standards transcends all of those questions about right and wrong. Anything that the sovereign says is right. So there's no possible way for the sovereign to violate a contract, compact, agreement. There's no way for the sovereign to do anything that's just or unjust. Because in the doing of the thing, the sovereign is showing that the sovereign thinks that that's fine for him to do. Now, what we're going to see in Locke, as you read John Locke, is a different take on the state of nature. He, too, begins his discussion of the origins of civil society with an effort to understand how things would be if there were no government, if there were no civil society. And his understanding of this is quite a bit different than Hobbes's. And he, too, will make use of his quite different characterization of the state of nature to offer a quite different recommendation about what government should be like. So look for that in Locke as you read him. That's all.